Here in part 4, we're going to look at phenomenological psychology and existential psychology. Now, phenomenology is the name of an attitude of spiritual seeing in which one can see or experience something which otherwise remains hidden. At least this is how Max Scheler described what phenomenology is. And we can understand phenomenology as a method, a way of going about an epistemological quest to understand. And this is our link to hermeneutics. We're after understanding here. And we can also look at it as a movement, as a philosophical movement, a later and today a psychological movement called phenomenological psychology. Combines with existentialism to be called phenomenological existential psychology as a later manifestation. We can also understand it as an attitude. And that's how I would like to approach this firstly, is understanding the phenomenological attitude. Martin Heidegger told us that we can encounter a phenomenon with different attitudes, and that different attitudes will yield distinctly different phenomena. We can understand this as in contemporary terms, almost like a cognitive filter, like we bring to the experience part of what the experience is. The phenomenological attitude is scientific. The word is used scientific just like we use it's a human science, not a natural science, but it's scientific in that it's an attitude of looking at phenomena in a way that allows one to encounter the phenomena itself. The method of phenomenology is the mental attitude and procedures we use to become aware of and mute or squelch the personal and historical filters that we bring, the cultural filters that we bring to contribute to the phenomenal experience. So getting to the thing itself is the catchphrase of phenomenology. It refers to becoming aware of and canceling out our personal histories, our cultural histories, and squelching that subjective filter that we contribute to the event. So in this way, phenomenology is considered by phenomenologists to be an objective scientific quest to take into consideration what we bring to the event, culturally, historically. And this is the phenomenological attitude. It's a questioning, and we see this as being very similar into the tradition of hermeneutics. But in phenomenology, we're talking about the actual mental processes that go into the subjective experience. And the idea here is that in phenomenology, we get to a place where we can become so aware of those personal and cultural contributions that we can systematically eliminate them and get to the thing itself. That's the belief in phenomenology. So this is the attitude of phenomenology, that we contribute to the experience to such a degree that to get an objective encounter with the phenomenon, we must become aware of and systematically eliminate our personal contributions to the experience. So, for example, when we encounter our childhood home, we encounter a home that is different than the same home encountered by one who's a stranger to that home. The idea here is that it's not the same home. The individuals are encountering distinctly different objects, different homes. And so there are many historical tributaries to phenomenology, and we can offer an introduction to phenomenology that flows through certain individuals. So originators, I like to talk about originators, founder, and developers of phenomenology. And the originators, we can, as an introduction, trace back to Immanuel Kant, and then into Hegel, and then Franz Brentano, and then Edmund Husserl, who's considered to be the founder of phenomenology. So the originators could be Kant, Hegel, and Brentano. The founder would be Edmund Husserl, and then we have developers, people who developed the phenomenological procedures, attitude, methodology, movement after Husserl, and that would be Martin Heidegger, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Levinas, Paul Ricoeur, and Jean-Paul Sartre. And so with Sartre, with Heidegger as well, but with Sartre, we really see this linking with existential issues. But this is also true for Heidegger. But with Sartre, we really identify as existential psychology, and we're going to be turning to existential psychology as well after phenomenology. We can trace the origins of phenomenology, of Husserl's use of the term phenomenology, back to Kant. Kant had two works that we really focus on, and that is the Critique of Pure Reason and the Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science. Now, in the Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, Kant is arguing that psychology cannot be exclusively a natural science, that natural science by nature is deterministic, proceeding from hypothesis to theory to determinism of laws, lawful behavior, and that the human condition, the mind and free will, if we call it free will and choice, necessarily eliminates the possibility of determinism, genetic or environmental determinism. So this is a problem, of course, with psychology being a science. If one accepts that it is a science, a natural science, then the concept of choice is eliminated. The possibility of free will is eliminated. So in Immanuel Kant, we also see in the Critique of Pure Reason, he discusses the noumenal and the phenomenal world. Phenomenal meaning which leads to phenomenological. So this is the world as we experience it through the structures of our minds and what we've learned. And that's called impure reason. As we become educated, as we live in the world and we learn from it, we use what he calls impure reason. So pure reason, the Critique of Pure Reason, is, it's, in other words, examining how does the mind exist before anything is learned. That's really the Critique of Pure Reason. So we look at different ideas, transcendental idealism. These are the mental conditions that are necessary for experience, and intuition is the framework for the framework of the mind that exists before learning. If we understand science as being based on observation, what Kant was really exploring was the nature of observation. What is the mental event of observation? So if science starts at observation, Kant questions what is observation. Reading Critique of Pure Reason and Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science would be excellent for establishing the historical foundation of phenomenology. Now, Franz Brentano is perhaps the most influential thinker that we have in the history of psychology. It's really remarkable how many individuals this Brentano influenced, how many areas of psychology was influenced by Brentano. If we look at Brentano's ideas, he introduces the idea of active consciousness. So the mind isn't something like a container that contains facts. The mind is actively engaged in creating facts. This is from the Kantian tradition. So in psychology, from an empirical standpoint, he's using empirical, not meaning experimental, but empirical meaning through the senses, observational, in other words, descriptive. And in fact, he does a series of lectures made into a book now called Descriptive Psychology. And he's really arguing for a psychology that is like a hermeneutic psychology, description and understanding rather than causal experimentation. Brentano is really a central figure, as we said before, in the humanities-based psychology. And he introduces a concept called intentionality. And intentionality is thought is always related to something or some event. So when we say something's intentional, in other words, it's directed. When we think, we're thinking, and our thinking is directed towards something. Like we shine a light on something. So there's never just light shining. If you shine a beam of light into nothingness, there's nothingness is revealed. But intentionality is the idea that thought is directed. It's related to some things or some events. So thought is always interactive with objects. Now, when I say Brentano was influential with others, he was the professor of Edmund Husserl, who is the founder of phenomenology. We're now looking at Brentano, Kant, Hegel are originators. Husserl is the founder. He was the teacher of Karl Stumpf, who was the teacher of Wolfgang Kohler, Kurt Lewin, and Kurt Kafka. These are the founders of Gestalt psychology. Christian von Ehrenfels, who was a great pillar of philosophical background for the Gestalt psychologist. And Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud felt very highly of Brentano, studied with him at the University of Vienna, and even wrote about him to friends in letters saying how clever he found Brentano. So when we say that Brentano influenced quite a bit of psychology, this is really a who's who list here, from Stumpf, Kohler, Levine, Kafka, Husserl, Freud, von Ehrenfels. It's really remarkable. Let's turn now to the founder of phenomenology, Edmund Husserl. Husserl, it was a student of Brentano, and certainly was affected by Brentano's idea of an active psychology, an active consciousness rather than consciousness as a container. Consciousness as a container was really the position that was being taken widely in experimental natural science psychology. So Husserl was very critical of natural science and also what's called psychologism. And psychologism is, in an extreme form, is solipsism, and that means that the mind creates all reality. And Husserl was against this thought as well. He was interested in the things themselves, maybe what Kant called the noumena. So he developed a method of describing what appears in consciousness without preconceptions of history and culture. So, in other words, through education, through growing up and just learning, through watching others and interacting with the world, Husserl he developed a method in which he felt that we could get to the thing in itself, absent of the history and the culture and the learning and our psychological processes. He referred to natural science as, in a pejorative way, as naturalism, and he used this as a pejorative term for the belief that the methods of natural science can be used in all types of knowledge. He felt that there were some things that natural science was very good at, and this attitude that it could be used for everything, he in a pejorative sense, used as naturalism. So to the things themselves, how do you get there? Well, the method is called the phenomenological reduction, and it has two aspects to it, two moments. And these moments aren't really steps. You don't do number one and then number two. They kind of occur simultaneously. You have to meditate on the things that we're thinking about. So this idea of the epoche, or the bracketing in the phenomenological reduction, is you're suspending all captivations and acceptedness. So what's a captivation and acceptedness? It's all the things in life that we take for granted, that we never question, all these things that seem just so matter of fact. We have to suspend all of our beliefs and what we think reality is. We have to suspend our belief in ourselves, belief in the world we live in. It's called bracketing out, suspending the belief. So all the things that we typically don't even think about, we have to get to a point where we can meditate to a point of not taking them for granted, not being captivated in accepting them as it is. So even something like the concept of gravity, in a phenomenological reduction, part of the epoche would be to bracket the belief out of gravity, to the preconception, space, time, all of these things, the world, all the rules of whatever we might be bringing to our experience, the rules of science, so the rules of philosophy, anything must be suspended. And we have to, and this is called the epoche, the reduction. And then once we have suspended, firstly meditated and become aware of the things that we've become captivated into an acceptance, and we then bracket those things out, and then we meditate on what we're left with. And that meditation is the transcendental, will yield transcendental insights that are independent of the preconceived notions of knowledge, our culture, our society, what we believe in, etc. And this is really the method of the phenomenological reduction, the bracketing that Husserl develops. Now, Martin Heidegger takes the foundations that Husserl puts in phenomenology and really advances them in directions that become radically different than Husserl's original project. And we're going to just touch on a little bit of the basic link between Heidegger as the link between phenomenology and existentialism, because Heidegger really begins to enter into the question with phenomenology into existentialism, which he then develops into a new way of looking at things called ontology. So let's get a few basic ideas of Heidegger. We have words that Heidegger invents. He comes up with new ways of describing things. This is a way of dislodging. It's actually doing the phenomenological reduction in a way. It's dislodging ourselves from the familiarity of the words that we use. So instead of talking about me or myself as an object, a subject of an object, he talks about Dasein. And this is like being in the world. And we can use Dasein as existence, meaning human existence. We often see in Heidegger talking about being and being with a small b and being with a capital B. And this would be the distinction as being in a physical time and space and being in existence. So Dasein is being with a big B. Heidegger said that Dasein is the being that cares about being. So in other words, this is the physical entity that has an interest and cares about existence. So we see that this is, we're getting to very philosophical types of conversations about the idea of what it means when we say to be. What does this mean? Heidegger wasn't talking about I and world, but being world embeddedness. So it's like elimination. Heidegger takes us to an elimination of subject and object so that we have like intersubjectivity, meaning that reality, I don't do the world and I do, we aren't separate entities. In other words, I'm not describing the world and I'm not a product of the world. We are mutually embedded, mutually giving rise to each other. And so the world is considered to be the totality of all events and things. Now, here's where we enter with Heidegger into existentialism. Every being must face non-being. Non-being is what he refers to as death. Now, if we think about this, the way that these terms are being used, non-being versus being, we really, instead of just death, it becomes cliche. The cliche of death. Non-being is is a bracketing out of the cliche preconceptions of the term death. The non-being is the absence of existence. Authenticity is when one escapes from accepting one's mindness of non-being. So when an individual accepts their sense of possessing death, they can start to live from a place of what Heidegger calls authenticity. And authenticity becomes a very important part of existentialism, being authentic, living the authentic life. Later we'll find that some thinkers, including Sartre and then later Erich Fromm, will talk about the ways of living inauthentically in bad faith. Heidegger talks about I having the freedom to choose meaning in my existence. And really laying down the foundations for existentialism, Heidegger is saying here that we don't find ourselves. We choose ourselves. We create ourselves, that the self is an artistic expression in itself. Heidegger says we are unfree to death. So unfree to death means we have no choice in this matter. He calls, in some ways, there are some aspects of this where he makes a distinction between what he calls fallenness and thrownness. Thrownness is our unfreeness in existence. We were thrown into existence. We didn't choose to be here. We've been thrown into this. Now, fallenness is when we get so captivated into culture, and it's like herd mentality of Nietzsche. So fallenness is when we are subsumed into culture, and we live an inauthentic life. So how does an inauthentic life look? It's an inauthentic life refuses to acknowledge mortality and the existential issues, and is fallen, so feels that external forces make all the decisions for who one is or who one should be, etc. So Heidegger said, when we don't live up to our authenticity, we experience existential guilt. When we don't take responsibility for our own being. And existential anxiety is the assurance of death frees us from the need to conform to social norms. Heidegger also makes a distinction between the ontic and the ontological. Simply put, you can understand the ontic as everything natural science observes and measures. The ontological is what we're doing in a humanities-based psychology. We're looking at using hermeneutics, phenomenology. Ontology is the meditation on that which is not covered by the ontic, on the big being. So if ontic is covering being with a small b, space and time physicality of our bodies, ontological is the study of the big B, the essence of being, the study of what it means to be, to exist. Next in our investigation of phenomenology and the extension of Martin Heidegger, we would consider Maurice Merleau-Ponty, French philosopher, and Emmanuel Levinas. Maurice Merleau-Ponty is best known for his book, The Phenomenology of Perception. He also wrote a shorter version of this called The World of Perception. So Phenomenology of Perception is a massive book, and it's very complicated. It's difficult to understand Merleau-Ponty without first studying Heidegger. And one finds that when they want to approach Heidegger, they have to go back to Husserl, which means you have to go back to Hegel and Kant. The study of phenomenology is, when I first began studying Heidegger, I found that it necessitated I had to work years and study people before Heidegger to begin studying Heidegger. And this is true of Merleau-Ponty. We must understand Heidegger before entering into Merleau-Ponty, I think. I'd argue that at least. Otherwise, it's too difficult. But if you want an entrance into Merleau-Ponty, the World of Perception is a thin little book of 5 or 6 lectures that were presented on radio. I believe it was on the BBC, that kind of put the phenomenology of perception in a nutshell. So that might be a good way to enter this. But Merleau-Ponty, the basic gist of Merleau-Ponty's ideas is that the basic feature of human existence isn't intentionality. It's not being conscious of something, but it's embodiment. And embodiment is the idea that we come to experience the world through our flesh envelope, as I've heard it put in the past, through our sense organs, our skin, our eyes, our tongues, our ears, our noses. We come to experience the world through embodiment. And this certainly challenges not only the Cartesian mind-body dualism, but also the idea of contemporary information processing psychology, that the brain is the high altar of reality. In this way, embodied cognition, we'd call it, Merleau-Ponty's talking about the body as being the thing within which we come to connect with reality. Now, if Merleau-Ponty was looking at the phenomenology of embodiment, Emmanuel Levinas was looking at what he called alterity. This is otherness. And what Levinas was pointing out was a psychology that focuses on the me, the myself, the I. It's ultimately problematic. The I does not exist in isolation, but always becomes meaningful from what he calls otherness. alterity. So the Western psychological preoccupation with reason and immanence, what he called immanence, which is the time and space, and an egological self, the I as the ultimate place where we look for understanding reality. He said this is problematic, and we have to look towards the other, towards otherness. So his philosophical work revolves around exploring what he calls otherness, and our I guess we could call our meditation on describing how we understand ourselves through the other. This has a little bit of a feel of things sort of like the looking glass self that we find in sociology. We turn now to existentialism proper. And if we look at this list of individuals that we're discussing, we see that the three in the bottom, the basis of existentialism, would be Soren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Martin Heidegger. I like to think of, so I often talk about Kierkegaard as being about Christian existentialism or faith existentialism, belief in God, and I talk about Nietzsche and Heidegger as being secular existentialism. They're dealing with the same issues, but Kierkegaard goes back to a Christian existentialism, a faith existentialism, whereas Heidegger and Nietzsche are secular existentialists. Here are the big names we have in existential theory and existential psychology: Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus, Ludwig Binswanger, and Viktor Frankl. So we're not going to go into an in-depth discussion of Heidegger, Nietzsche, or Kierkegaard, but these are the folks you start out with. These are the folks that the others, Sartre, Beauvoir, Camus, Binswanger, and Frankl, are going to be referring back to. So what is existentialism? It's the study of existence, as Heidegger taught us, the being that cares about being. I like Irvin Yalom. He's the author of Existential Psychotherapy. This is a textbook that is a formidable textbook that's just a great introduction to existentialism and also its use in psychotherapy. Yalom talks about existentialism in four ways. He talks about issues of freedom, so in other words, free will. As we saw, this is contrasted with the Enlightenment scientific revolution idea of either biological or environmental determinism, so popular in psychology today. So existentialism deals with freedom, with the will, in other words. What is the responsibility we have once we understand this willfulness, this freedom? How do we make meaning in our lives? And coming to terms with mortality, with death. So these are the four major themes Yalom talks about in existential psychotherapy, and we can use these. They work nicely to understand an introduction to existentialism. Some of the psychological events that we deal with in existentialism are ideas like anxiety, despair, death, hope, openness, authenticity. These are all words that you'll be seeing as you study existentialism as a psychology. So looking at Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre read Heidegger. It's been noted that Heidegger felt that Sartre misunderstood what he read, what Heidegger had written. And there's some technical reasons for this, whereas, for example, Heidegger eliminated the distinction, the subject-object distinction. Jean-Paul Sartre still relied on a subject-object psychology of existential psychology. So meaningful life comes from living one's philosophy, Sartre says. You create meaning in your life and through living the philosophy that you've navigated, that you've developed. He said liberation, freedom, comes through solidarity with others. Remember, Sartre was someone who fought in the French Resistance and during the Nazi occupation of Paris. He felt very closely to the idea that solidarity was the key. Solidarity, meaning relationships with others, peace, love, and respect of others, would give us liberation. in these existential issues liberation is talking about. Sartre famously said, existence precedes essence, so we determine who we are. This is the ultimate freedom. His famous quote that he used is, hell is just other people, in his play No Exit. And this is the idea that there are others in the world besides me, and we have to navigate those others. So what he referred to as hell is the emotion that we feel when others challenge the mask we wear, the meaning that we've developed for ourselves. When others challenge this or seem not to believe in it, it becomes, we start to experience those emotions then of anxiety and depression, etc., etc. And personal freedom, he says, comes from social existence. Again, here we see this idea of solidarity in Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre's partner, Simone de Beauvoir, is regarded as one of the first feminist existentialists, and she wrote the text The Second Sex. And she felt that existence, female existence, writing from the woman's perspective, existence is engendered in a patriarchy. So in other words, in a phallocentric, male-dominated idea of what existence is. She often said she was not a partner of Sartre. See, the partner of Sartre puts Sartre in the centralized and she in the marginalized position, but she partnered with Sartre. And she was also interested in making a distinction between sex and gender as a performance. Albert Camus introduced the ideas of the absurd, which then made its way into painting of all sorts and literature. I'm thinking of people such as Samuel Beckett and the entire Dada movement, etc. So the absurd. And the absurd is this this discrepancy that we understand between our search for meaning and the meaningless existence. So we are aware that we are creating meaning in a meaningless existence, and that's the absurdity. Again, like Sartre, Camus felt that solidarity, love, and friendship are the ways to bring meaning into one's life. And Camus felt that the most important question to be asked in philosophy was the question of suicide. And of course, in existentialism, suicide is the ultimate act of free will, the choice of to be or not to be. When we look at existential psychology, we can talk about Ludwig Binswanger. And Binswanger he adapted Heidegger's philosophy into a psychotherapy, and he called it Daseinanalyse. So analysis is an existential analysis. So how a person interprets life events, anxieties, fears, and personal values is what is to be analyzed here. This is interesting if you're familiar with the popular movie that came out a few years ago called I Heart Huckabees. This is a really interesting way to explore these ideas of Dasein analysis, existential analysis. In the film is a comedy about an individual who becomes involved in an existential analysis and existential investigators who try to piece together and help him to be aware of how he has formed meaning in his life. It's a fascinating film, and it's very interesting. It's a great introduction to existential analysis, and it's funny. But Binswanger talked about three modes of personal existence. He said that we can have a personal existence in the Umwelt, the Mitwell, and the Eigenwell. So the Umwelt is the natural world and events, so maybe if natural science would be looking at. And the Mitwelt is the shared interactions we have with others. It's the social existence. It's social not conscientiousness, but consciousness, in other words, logged in socially. And Eigenwelt is the personal world. It's our maybe our internal world. It's our personal thoughts and fantasies. And the Welterwur is the world design. And this is the mental world that people live in, and it's challenged and described by the existential analyst. That's what individuals are looking. What the analyst does, it helps to introduce the individual to their Weltenwurf. Viktor Frankl wrote a very famous short book called Man's Search for Meaning and developed the therapy called logotherapy. And he was interested in one question: why were there so few suicides in the concentration camps? Viktor Frankl himself spent years in a concentration camp and was serviced other prisoners as a physician. Frankl said that death allows life to have meaning. Without death, life would have no meaning. There would be every action would be meaningless. That we have to have purposeful behavior necessarily because there's a limitation to our time here, to our existence. Frankl said ultimately, a person who has a reason to live, who has meaning, can live through anything. And the answer to life's difficulties is meaning making, creating purpose. Where Sartre famously said the meaning of life is asking the question, what is the meaning of life? Viktor Frankl would say the meaning of life is to make meaning, to create the purpose. So in this idea of finding oneself, it would be creating oneself, not finding oneself. Dereflection, Frankl said, refers to breaking compulsive self-reflection, like the preoccupation with the ego, the self. A paradoxical intention is a method used to encourage to do the things we desire. So in obsessive compulsive disorder, to whatever the prohibitive, whatever the prohibited act is or thought is, to actually engage with that thought, Frankl said, would free oneself from the taboo of it. And anticipatory anxiety is the idea that the fear of ridicule produces ridicule. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, the idea that we have anxiety over the anticipation of ridicule, which then brings the ridicule about. And this is Frankl's, some basics of Viktor Frankl's. Again, Man's Search for Meaning. The first half recounts his theory and his story of being in the concentration camp. The second half of that book discusses logotherapy and how to find meaning in one's life. And so this is the basics of what we call existential psychology. Existentialism, existential psychology, how it comes out of Martin Heidegger and Phenomenology and Husserl. And these are really the more substantive, the largest parts of what we call a humanities-based psychology.